Importing Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator files into After Effects takes a couple of extra steps. And because you will likely work with Photoshop and probably work with Illustrator files, it's a good idea to get a sense of how this all works. So before we go to After Effects, let me just show you a couple of files inside Illustrator and Photoshop. We'll start off with Photoshop. This is the Photoshop file that we're going to work with in this course. And I have a layer for each one of the appendages here. For example, I got right forearm. That's this character's right forearm. I think he's facing us, isn't he? And right hand. There you go, and the head. So when I bring this in After Effects, I want to retain all these layers so that I can animate them individually. It'd be kind of foolish to go to all the trouble to create all these separate layers and then bring this guy in as one image and then try to animate it. So much easier to animate it with all these individual parts here. So that's what we can do when we import this into After Effects. One little tip. When you're creating something like this in Photoshop, it's really good to name all the layers really distinctively. So instead of saying layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, something like that, really give them a name so when you bring them in After Effects, you'll retain those names and be able to figure out what it is you're working on. All right, that's a fairly straightforward process for Photoshop. Let's take a look at Illustrator. Illustrator is a little more complicated. Typically, when people make something like this, they make one layer and then they have all kinds of groups inside the layer. And so when you bring that into After Effects, that one layer will be all that comes in. It doesn't separate out the groups. So if you want to have individual layers to work on in After Effects, which you probably do, then you need to change all those groups into layers. And the way you do that typically is you select one layer that has all those groups, then you go to this little flyout menu here, and you say Release to Layers Sequence. And that'll separate all the layers so you can then work with them individually inside After Effects. If you choose Build, it sort of has this little building process where it starts with a bottom layer and then builds on top of that and builds on top of that. So you probably don't want to use that. You probably want to use this sequence side of things. Now, I've already done that in this case. So this thing started out as one layer with all these groups inside, and then I took them all out to make sure I had separate layers like that. But if you are working with Illustrator files, then you do want to check them out and make sure that you've got the Release to Layers selected, or you've separated them out into layers. And again, name them so you can figure things out later. I've got these named by type of thing and numbers just to try to make sure I can find them later inside After Effects. Alrighty, let's open up After Effects now and take a look at these two guys. To do that, let's just double click on the icon here. We can just close out of this welcome screen because we're not going to save this project. And now I want to import the Photoshop and Illustrator files we looked at. Let me show you one thing that you can do that will not work the way you want things to work, and then we'll go take a look at the right way to do it. I've shown you before that you can import by going File, Import. That's fine. But the shortcut to do it is just double-clicking here in an empty space in the project panel. So just double-click there, and that opens up the Import dialog box. I want to track down that Photoshop file, the Puppet Photoshop file here inside the Working Files Photo Spin Assets folder. And there it is. And now I'm going to bring in something else with it. Instead of bringing it in individually, I want to bring something else in with it too. So I'm going to go get that clock. I'm going to Control or Command click on that to select the clock. And on top of things, I'm going to select an image file just to kind of completely mess things up. So now if I click Open, all three of those guys will come in, but the Illustrator and the Photoshop files are not broken down into layers because I brought them in as a group. If you bring them in as a group, they will not break down into layers. If I just take a look at, let's say, the Puppet file here and bring it down and make a new comp from it, like this, look at it, it's just a single layer. There's nothing about that. If I want to move it around, it'll move the entire thing, not individual arms and legs, what have you. Not what we wanted. Same thing with the clock and gears. If I bring it down and make a new comp from it too is going to be one large chunk of stuff, not what we wanted to do there. So if you bring in a group, it won't work the way you want it. I'm going to undo all this by just deleting all those guys. Yep. So now we need to bring in the Illustrator file and the Photoshop file individually. So I'm going to go double click here again. Go down and get that Puppet file down here. There you go, double click on it. So I could click on that, click open, but double clicking does the same thing. The thing is, when I double click, I'm going to bypass this little thing here where it says import as something, and this time really do have a choice. The trouble is, it's redundant. You don't need to select anything here because you get another crack at this after you open it up. So I'm just going to double click this and not worry about the fact that it says footage, which is not the selection I want to make. Double click, and then I get this dialog box that asks me the exact same question: footage, composition, or composition retained layer sizes. We want to bring this in as a composition. The choice is between composition blank or composition retain layer sizes. And retain layer sizes is usually what you want to do. I'm going to show you the wrong way than the right way. I'm going to choose composition here. And then here it says editable layer styles or merged layer styles into footage. If you put layer styles on layers inside Photoshop, you can bring those layer styles into After Effects and you can edit them. It's really a very powerful feature of After Effects. Very cool. So almost always you want to retain the editable layer styles. Now I'm going to click OK. In it comes. And when it comes in, it has all the layers here in a folder, which is really cool. And then puts all those layers inside a composition right there, automatically creating a composition named Puppet after the file. I double click on this composition, open it up, and there are all those layers there. So now if I select, let's say, right calf like that, right calf is down here. But if you see a little bounding box, it goes around the entire layer. The right calf fits the entire layer, and that really isn't probably what you want to do. I'm going to open this up and rotate it. You'll see that it rotates around the entire layer, centered at the center of the layer like that, which can be kind of cumbersome if you want to rotate, the leg connecting to the knee, something like that. Just takes a little bit more work if you bring it in just as a composition. So I'm going to delete that guy. We'll go back and get it the way that is probably the more effective way. Go down here and get Puppet again. This time I'm going to say, instead of composition, I want to retain the layer sizes like that. And we'll keep it editable layer styles, although there were no layer styles in this case, but that would be the normal thing. And now let me show you the difference. I'll open that back up again. We'll go down there and get that right leg again. Where is that right leg? Right calf there. Notice now the bounding box is just as big as the calf. Not as big as the entire composition, or just as big as this little part of it here. Now when I rotate it, it's still not going to rotate the way I want it. It's going to rotate on the center right there, but it's a little bit easier to fix this thing down the road. We'll change what's called the anchor point. We'll attach it to the knee when we work on this project, but at least here it's more logical. It's just the object that we're working with. So when you bring in a layered Photoshop document, you probably want to retain layer sizes. Okay, let's go get the Illustrator file. So double click here. Now again, when I click it, I get these options here, bring in as footage, composition, or composition retain layer sizes, but this is superfluous because when I double click it, I get that same dialog box right here. So I want to bring it in not as footage because it would just be flat, just that one layer. This little merged layers thing is going to go away when I change over to composition like that. Here, the option to change footage dimensions is down here instead of up here. I want not document size, but I want layer size. But let me show you again what happens if we bring in document size. I'll click that, click OK. And again, we've got all the layers right there, all named the way we named them, arm 1, arm 2, like that. We've got this composition already made for us. Double click it to open it up. There's the composition right down there. I want to go down here a little bit and look for the solid gear number 1 right there. Now, solid gear number 1 is this guy right there, but you'd never know that based upon the bounding box, because the bounding box is the size of the entire composition. See those little blocks there? That's the size of the bounding box. So if I move it, I move the whole thing like that, whole bounding box. If I want to rotate it, it's going to rotate around the entire thing, which is, clearly would be a really weird clock if it rotated like that, right? So usually you don't want to bring it in as a document size. You want to bring it again as layer size. So I'm going to get rid of all this stuff here. And we'll go back and go get it as a layer size. Double click here and get the clock and gears again. Instead of document size, we're going to have it be layer size and click OK. We'll open this composition up again. Go down to that solid gear number 1 right there. Now you see the bounding box is just around the gear. And the center happens to be the center of the gear, which isn't, always where you want it. In this case, it's going to work perfectly for us. So we'll go rotate that guy like so, and it's going to rotate exactly in place, which makes our lives a whole lot easier. Now, this won't be the case for the hands, for example, because the center of the hands, for example, our hand here is right there. So if I rotate it, it's going to rotate on the center rather than down here, but we're just going to move the so-called anchor point to have it rotate properly later. But for the most part, these guys rotate on themselves like that, and the center of the object is the center of the rotation. So that's going to work really effectively when we work with this particular Illustrator file. So that is how you prepare Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator files, and then how you bring them in, how you import them into After Effects.